tremendous job helping with the conference, and thank you to the conference organizing team. I have the distinct pleasure to introduce Bill Balée. I want to make sure that you can hear me. Can you hear me? Yes? Great. Thank you. So I'm going to give you a proper introduction, Bill. Bill received his bachelor's in anthropology from the University of Florida. He has a double master's from Columbia University. He received his PhD in 1984 from Columbia. He's been at Tulane for a lot of his career. Before that, he was at the New York Botanical Garden. He's worked at professional posts in Brazil. He's twice served as department chair for the Department of Anthropology at Tulane, currently ending that term, something that he and I have talked a little bit about, which is great. 10 or more edited and authored books, most recently Sowing the Forest. At least 60, 70 articles, book chapters, a lot of them lead and sole authored, a lot of grants, etc. Bill is, in my mind, known as the founding or a founding and pivotal figure in the interdisciplinary research program of historical ecology that we, even if we don't know it, we all benefit from through the Society of Ethnobiology. His tireless and extensive works have shown the world the long-term ecological hallmarks of human environmental interactions, mostly in the Amazon. He's contributed substantially to the recognition that people are within, in, and are environments. So I know Bill mostly through the Society of Ethnobiology, and when I looked back, it was eerily interwoven. So here's what I'm going to say about that. Bill was the editor of the journal in 2001 when I first submitted a paper there, and he helped me get it published there when I was just out of graduate school. He organized the conference in 2009 at Tulane when I was the treasurer of the Society of Ethnobiology, so we worked closely together. He became vice president in 2011, and that's then president-elect. And he helped award the first Distinguished Ethnobiologist Award to Dick Ford at Columbus, Ohio. So this award, started with you in many ways. He became president of Society of Ethnobiology in 2013 when my spouse and I hosted the meeting in Denton, Texas. Odd, right? And this conference, I'm vice president-elect when I get to announce the Distinguished Ethnobiologist Award for you. So it's just really I'm not your student in many ways, but definitely interwoven. So I wanted to conclude this introduction with some comments from his PhD students. So Mark Blaney says, related to his PhD with Bill, I am so grateful that Bill's open-minded, ahead of his time approach to ethnobiology prompted him to take a chance on my ideas. Without his support, I wouldn't have published my book, nor would I be working in my dream job as a psychedelic psychotherapist. Kind of cool. Yeah, I'm an animal guy, so that's pretty cool. Others note how Bill connected them to experts, supported their projects in areas outside of his interests and outside of his regions of interest. James Andrew Whitaker states he is a great inspiration and models everything to which an anthropologist and ethnobiologist should aspire. James Welsh, Bill took me under his wing, immediately manifesting his style of dedicated and unconditional support for students. There are much longer comments that I'm going to share with you over email. Cassandra White states that Bill's work and influence have continued to inform her teaching and research. She continues to see Bill as a supportive mentor. Finally, after being Bill's student in his unforgettable classes, Darren Collins writes, I wanted my career to look exactly like his. As it turns out, our careers didn't align. Neither of us imagined I would become a college president. Bill supported me and mentored me and advised me to be the best version of myself. So I think the reach and significance of Bill's many-faceted career are evident in his accolades and through his students and through the society. Please join me in welcoming and congratulating Bill Balée, 2023's Distinguished Ethnobiologist. And before you clap, we have a gift for you, but now clap. So, So this piece of property on behalf of the society is for me, you purchase it for me. And there's a certificate in here as well. And so you want to get it out later and show it off? Sure. You want to show it off? Be careful. All right. I got the bag. Just a gift from the society to Bill. Okay. Here, let's put it right here, and then I'll put it back there. So, all right.
Well, thank you, Steve. Very touched. Some professors have a proclivity for talking too much. And I guess sometimes that's my thing. I maybe sometimes talk. This time, I'm kind of speechless and it's hard to come up with words. So I need to use this monitor over here. Anyway, from the bottom of my heart, I am grateful to the nominators and board of the Society of Ethnobiology for this singular distinction. It's the highest thing I could get in my field. And it was the last thing in the world I expected when I got the notification that I had won this singular distinctive award. So nobody gets to a moment like this without accruing debts along the way. And my journey of lifelong excursions into ethnobiology and encounters with new data reflect that. So let's start there. Intellectual foundation. So I studied anthropology at Columbia, and my advisors on the left, Robert Murphy. On the extreme right was Marvin Harris. I took a number of classes with him. Both of them had studied with Julian Stewart, who is in the middle next to his Shoshone collaborator, and he's the inventor of cultural ecology. That was more or less the training I had when I went into the field and did my dissertation, which I finished in 1984. But that changed. 1984, with apologies to Orwell, that was a pretty big change in my my way of thinking and my approach and to the relationship between people and the environment. And I had people that I was influenced by in that sense. So I would point to the second from the left, that's Daryl Posey. He told me at a meeting in 1984 in Belém, Brazil, he said, "It's so good that you're gonna, that you're an ethnobiologist." And I thought, I'm not an ethnobiologist, but little did I know then that I would be very soon thereafter. On the right of him is Sir Ian Prance. He wasn't Sir at the time, he is now, who was director of the Institute of Economic Botany at the New York Botanical Garden, who gave me a postdoc, which lasted for 4 years, in which I got a lot of research done in the Amazon on the relationship between people and plants. On the extreme right is Professor David Campbell, who's a professor of ecology at Grinnell College. And he and I went to the field together in 1984. And from him, I learned the number of ecological techniques related to forest inventory in a tropical forest. On the extreme left is, I'm with, this was just a few years ago, Pierre Grenan, French ethnobiologist. And I very much, thank you, very much respected his work. He went beyond, ethnobotany, but he had a huge ethnobotanical study that he did with YMP people who were related to the Kaipor people with whom I'd done my dissertation. In a linguistic sense, they are speakers of Tupi-Guarani languages. And he included a vast amount of information in this ethnobiological study that he did, and I consider him one of the pioneers of ethnobiology in Amazonia. So I was trying to think of the debts that I've accrued to people, and I thought I would start with co-authors. The thing is I didn't get to the end of this list. I mean, it will go on, probably another 10. There's at least 20 on here, and I've learned from all of them. They're from diverse fields: archaeologists, linguists, ecologists, lithics archaeologists, ceramicists of archaeology, botanists, and social anthropologists. And see, these are many of the places where I've worked in my career. Most of them are places where a language in the Tupi family is spoken. And most recently, I've been working on the extreme left, which is an isolated language. It's called Waurani. But I also worked all the way down there in the south with Marilyn Ceboja with the Mbia Guarani, whose language, interestingly, is really close to the Kaipor, who live all the way up there at the top. They're on the right, they're the middle yellow place marker. And just to give you an idea of their reserve, this is where they live today on the left. And the other map shows you sort of how they're ensconced and surrounded by what is sometimes called civilization, but it's crowding in on them. At the same time, since about 2003, they've developed their own cooperative with the intention of defending these lands, and it has become relatively effective against the logging industry, which in the early 2000s had invaded. That's what caused those two white lines going around the place marker down there. Those were logging trails of illegal logging that went in the early 2000s, but they have gotten themselves out of that since. And this is a symbol of their society that they used at the recent, well, it was 2018, International Congress of Ethnobiology, and where they were present. And the man on the left, bottom left next to me is one of my main collaborators. I call him W in my most recent book, Sowing the Forest. So we'll leave him at that for now. And next to him is a shaman, and at the end is another collaborator of mine, Piraha, Kaipor people. And they are a family-oriented people, as are many of the indigenous people in South America. They're kin-based society. And this is, again, W, I'll call him W, talking to me at that meeting in 2018 of the International Congress of Ethnobiology. And what comes to mind is one of the things we talked about recently is what was the indigenous word for culture? Because a lot of indigenous languages actually have a word for culture in an anthropological sense almost, or one would want to know. And that was because when I was helping them found their cooperative in the early 2000s, I heard W's brother say something, Yande Cultura. Yande means hour, and cultura is Portuguese for culture. And I didn't ask at that time, well, you don't have a word for that. But later I thought, by 2018, I asked W here, I said, do you have an indigenous, do you have a Kaipor word for cultura? And he said, oh yeah, it's shoha. And shoha literally means placemaking. Sho is place, and ha is an agentive suffix that turns it into placemaking. So I thought that is really all the peoples that I've worked with. I think of them as placemaking peoples in the Amazon region because they tend to know places where ancestors have altered the environment, and they utilize these environments in ways that are, unique. It's not simply that they use a primary forest, but they also use living archaeological resources that are the trees and some of the fauna that lives in those particular forests as a result of the alterations, modifications to the land that their ancestors and other ancient peoples had effected. So I've been thinking a lot about that term shoha. And they ask you, I'm on WhatsApp with W here. We talk on the phone every now and then. And one of the first questions that did a shoha, how are you in your place? It's sort of the question, and what is your place like? That's another way of saying, how you doing? So I find that to be essential to understanding their culture, is that from an ethnobiological point of view, their culture is truly intrinsically connected to the landscape. You can't understand the culture without understanding the landscape and their particular sense of interaction and management of the landscape. And that goes beyond the trees because, you know, ethnobiologically, we see that there's an intersection between plants and animals, as you can see here in the use of Clybadium sylvestre, which is a fish poison and actually paralyzes the gills of fish and brings to the surface. It's a domesticated plant also. And in the upper, you see a woman here who's in the creek catching fish. And on the upper right in that bowl is armored catfish, looks like. And there's some Carrison fish in the middle and other fish, I'm not sure what that, that's called jeju in Portuguese on the bottom. And this is the plant that they use for that particular purpose, to paralyze the gills of fish that helps them catch the fish and doesn't permanently toxify the water or the environment. And these are the leaves after they've been crushed up here on the left. The bowl, this is another event, a fishing event. And on the right, you see a makeshift grill, which I thought was pretty cool, using the bicycle, you know, recycling, indigenous recycling. And this was just in, I think it was 2018 or 2019, I visited one of their villages. This is another one of my main collaborators on the right. His name is Petroin. You see him also on the left and on the right in a line. And he and W both were involved in putting together an exhibit that lasted for 10 years at the National Museum of the American Indian, which I heard somebody talk about earlier today. And I was officially designated as translator. So it was quite an experience to have them come up to Washington, D.C. People had never been on an airplane before in some cases, so, and share their cultural knowledge. So in talking about placemaking, shoha, this view on the left shows you at the top is an old swidden field. Above and below, there are two old swidden fields, and in the middle is a young one. And what ultimately will happen, which would happen with that village in the middle, is that it will become an anthropogenic, or what I call cultural forest, because in part, there's an interaction between humans and the dispersal mechanism of certain species. They leave a gap, like the small gap of a couple of acres like that, for the planting the manioc, which is one of the main sources of calories in their diet. And from riverbanks and other places where you have a lot of sunlight, or even other gaps, certain species that are moved about by birds or by anemochory, by the wind, such as Handroanthus, which comes in purple and yellow varieties of flowers. It's an enormous tree, but it would not grow there were it not for the fact that it was an open field where the seed was able to land and become viable and grow there. So what in effect over the long term they do is they change the alpha diversity. They change the local diversity because you don't lose the high forest around it, and you've actually added in some species that otherwise wouldn't be there. And it doesn't mean people are interfering or modifying DNA. It simply means that they are moving species around into different environments and in a sense managing those environments as cultural landscapes. And this was an aerial view I took many years ago from a small plane coming into a village in the middle of the Copper Reserve. And there you see these Handroanthus species, the yellow flowered and the purple flowered ones, which indicate that whole area is an area of what they call tapair. Tapair is the indigenous word for cultural forest. So T-A-P-A-I-R would be the pronunciation, tapair. And it reflects the shoha, or the placemaking of the ancestors who had earlier had swidden fields and secondary swidden fields and villages in those same places. So when I said I learned a lot from co-authors, I've learned from professors, teachers, so on. You know, I learned a huge amount from many indigenous consultants over many years about, you know, how I got to this moment today. Really, it's a lot of debts I accrued are to them. And in my study of Cockpur ethnobiology, I learned about management of game supplies, and the man on the right's holding up the tortoise, yellow-footed tortoise, that men are required to provide this to their women folk at different times in their periodic cycles. And what that effectively does is it means that animals that are attracted in close to swidens, which are much larger than tortoises, such as different deer and tapir and white-lipped peccaries that like to come into gardens and eat the garden foods, are not hunted, because increasingly to get these tortoises, one has to expand the catchment area and go farther and farther away. And while they're doing that, these game animals coming in closer to their food producing gardens are not being hunted. I think of that as a kind of a management, which is done through the marital requirements, which are also based in religion. None of that separated in Cockpur ideology and philosophy. All of these things constitute one big thing. And somebody talked yesterday about holism. This is, I think, one of the first talks. I think your talk, yes. I completely agree with that, because that's how they see things in a holistic manner. It isn't broken up into academic fields or into things like economy, subsistence, religion, kinship, but rather it's all of one philosophy. I also learned classifications of the flora, nomenclature of the flora, and it's terms like the classification, the nomenclature that can tell you about things that happened in the past. You can actually learn through the language itself of the chronology of events in terms of the agricultural lifestyle and changes in the environment that occurred as a result of people's occupations and their use and management of the landscape. I learned from them the very first concept I ever learned about cultural anthropogenic forests was from them, because I was talking to a collaborator of mine. So I'd like to go out, you know, tomorrow and collect some plants in the forest. He said, well, you want to go to the top pair? I said, well, I'm not sure what that is. He said, it's not a forest, but it looks like a forest. I thought, that's an interesting idea. Let's go out and see. And so I walked in, and the first thing I noticed when we walked into this new forest about 5 kilometers from the village off the trail was I kicked my foot into the dirt, and a piece of an old manioc griddle popped up. It was probably 100 years old. And the soil there is different. It's darker, more fertile. And there were some other items in that artifactual forest that suggested, well, people actually have lived here and changed this forest before. It looks like a real forest, and it is a forest, but it's not, you know, in their classification, a ka'ate. That would be we might translate it as a primary forest. Ka'ate, true forest, literally is what that means. So I got that concept from them. And then it turns out that I learned from other groups in this same family, Tupi Guarani, that they use forests like that because the soil tends to be better, for the simple fact of people having used charcoal, burned things there, deposited organic residue and waste there, and changed soil characteristics, sometimes turning that soil into what's known as Amazon dark earth, which is extremely fertile, not impoverished like much of the rest of the Amazon basin soils. And one thing that does well there is maize. The groups that move around a lot, such as traditionally these people here on the bottom left, in the middle, and the bottom right, there were Arawete people. At the top is an Uruwewawao woman with maize, and that's an extended family longhouse of Uruwewawao people in southwestern Amazonia that I saw many years ago. They're dependent on maize because it allows them to get 2-3 crops a year, and they can also move around. They can keep on moving as trekking people without necessarily having to have stewardship on a permanent basis over other crops that require somewhat more care, such as bitter manioc over the long term, and that also take a lot longer to produce. some more pictures of Ottawa consultants that I worked with in the 1980s. And I learned a lot from. That's actually an earlier incarnation of myself over there on the right with some friends of mine. And this was a house where I stayed. At the top is the last known palm thatched residence of the two men below, who were the last two members of their tribe, Al Ray and Al Ra. They were Tupi Guarani speaking, but it was a new language. It's somewhat of a long story to tell you how I got to meet them, but I was also interested in how they, used the environment. And as it turns out, they are living in an environment that had a lot of Atalaya palms. And it's a pyrophyte. It does well where there's been some burning because it has cryptogal germination. The fruit will sprout and then grow downwards. The cotyledon will go down into the soil and can survive for up to 7 years down there. When there's a fire on the top for a purpose of making a swidden, the Atalaya palms, juvenile palms that are underground survive. And they can come back and dominate the landscape, as you see here in the background, behind the Guajá woman with the baby on the right. Those are Atalaya speciosa palms. And that was an old Kaapor village. So all these things sort of become connected, not just the people to the landscape, but people to other peoples, as a result of the fact that the landscapes that they changed became useful for people who don't necessarily use the land in exactly the way that they were using it themselves. So, and I've tried to put these kinds of landscape uses into a simple matrix concept of two kinds of primary landscape transformation. One where species numbers go down. Another primary landscape transformation where they go up. And primary landscape transformation, by that I mean almost a complete overhaul of the species that were there. And so it can typically often goes down, as we know. You could get that from military ordnance bombed on a forest or what have you. It was going to obviously reduce the species diversity that you get. The Belo Monte Dam on the Xingu River is another example of, huge hydroelectric project that locally on an alpha diversity level lowered diversity completely by flooding the whole area. So you had a huge overturn or turnover rather of species. That would be primary landscape transformation type 1. Type 2 is where the actual species can go up. And that's the case with major mound building projects of ancient peoples who Heiko Primrus, he's an archaeologist, he said that they had low density urbanism in the southwestern Amazon in Bolivia in the Beni Basin, where they built these huge mounds and causeways across a wetland savanna. Well, you get more species on the high well-drained ground than you do in the wetland itself. There are only a few tree species that will grow in the water, but there are many more that will grow on high and dry land. All that high and dry land was built by humans between 500 and 1500 years ago. That's a case of primary landscape transformation type 2, where species diversity actually goes up because of what people did in the environment, on the landscape. And likewise, secondary landscape transformation, it's where there is some turnover, but not complete turnover. So in the first case, it goes down. In the other, it can actually go up. As you see in the case of the Swidden field, on a small scale, you will get an increase in alpha diversity of the sort that I was talking about before, thanks to some other things that are going on, like gap building, which are not too big of gaps, anemochory, seed dispersal by birds, and other things that otherwise wouldn't necessarily be going into these areas and resulting in cultural forest. So although it might look like a bad thing, it's a small area that actually over time, and if you like diversity, and I heard somebody saying earlier that people like diversity, they like species increases in the environment. Well, you can get that with this methodology, long proven over many thousands of years. This is the same. I should say also that, and that you saw this slide before, in addition to the fact that alpha diversity goes up, I did ask them, I said, why is it that you just didn't make an entire Swidden why did you cut it off here and on these lines around the square? And they said, well, roughly rectangular area. And that's because there's a fire break at the bottom all around. I said, well, why would you bother to do that? And he said, well, because it's often the forest is going to be saturated with enough rainfall that you're not going to have a problem with fires escaping, but occasionally do. Like in an El Nino year, it might get too dry. And so fire breaks are set up around it. And the idea is so the fire doesn't go in and burn up the more mature manioc plants in the next garden above and below, where you can see at the very bottom right-hand corner, an older garden where they're still producing manioc, which is a subsistence crop. In any event, that kind of activity helps contribute to the secondary landscape transformation type 2 that I was referring to. And I put this into a matrix. It's a rather simple matrix that has to do with measuring things by the magnitude of species turnover. So you have two kinds of primary landscape transformation and two kinds of primary landscape and two kinds of secondary landscape transformation. In one, you get a virtually complete turnover species, either up or down, and in the other, you get a partial turnover, not a great huge turnover, and it either goes up or down. Just a way I'm using to conceive of the kinds of changes that people affect in Amazonian landscapes. It may apply elsewhere as well. This is an example of primary landscape transformation type 2, where the numbers actually go up. And this is where I was talking about in Bolivia, where I worked with Clark Erickson, the archaeologist, in the early 2000s. That's a causeway going across in the upper left that connects two large indigenous mounds that were built about 1,000 years ago. And here again, you see on the dry ground here in the lower left, there's also a small mound, occupation mound there, Handranthus trees growing, which, as I indicated before, spread by Anemocori, they tend to be found in gaps like that. And they do not grow in where there's water. They grow on the high dry ground. The upper right, you also have an area of primary landscape transformation type 2, because those are raised fields. That's actually Clark Erickson's picture, a photo that he took, wherein you could get semi-intensive agriculture long before there was even Swidden agriculture, because people were actually able to cultivate these fields above the flood level and grow various crops in them on a continuous basis, presumably, because the soil is so good. At the bottom, you see the causeway up close, and you can see that a number of trees can grow there. That's what gives you that line, but otherwise around it, they don't. And that's a place called Ibibate, which in the Siriano language, Siriano or Tupi-Guarani speaking people in Bolivia, means true ground or true high ground, Ibibate. I also have done some research with archaeologists that I've learned a lot from more recently with geoglyphs in the Southwest Amazon. Now, there are no living indigenous people there. And the archaeologist who invited me to come in and study the flora and the landscape of a geoglyph, I had to tell her, this late Professor Denise Sean, I said, well, I don't work where there aren't people, that could give ethnobiological information and I could talk to about the landscape and so on. She said, oh, there are people there. They're just dead. So these are archaeological sites. And from the air, I didn't take these pictures, but I've worked in one like this, except it was covered in forest and it was square. But upper right, when that was built, the area was forested, and it's about 20 feet deep and 40 feet wide. People made these gigantic soccer field sized enclosures. There's over 400 of them in an area about the size of the state of Iowa. I mean, so there was a lot going on between about 500 AD and 1500 AD in building these geoglyphs. For what reason, people aren't sure, but I think it has to do with gigantism and geometry, because they not only, they make great circles, but they also can make right angles without a compass and all of that. There's a way that you can do that, but what's interesting is that they could move so much dirt without having had an Iron Age. and make such very fine looking, architectural kinds of features on the landscape. And what I think of this is it's a case of primary landscape transformation type 2. Ensconced in the bottom down there, that's where that circle is, where you got a gigantic, huge deforestation area, which was for cattle at the time. That'd be primary landscape transformation type 1. So thought that was an interesting, coincidence. So when I did accept the invitation to check out the landscape by Professor Sean, way up there in the corner is where she was working, which is a geoglyph called JK. And it's a rectangular double-ditched geoglyph. It's huge. It's about 120 yards across by about 190 deep. And it's double-ditched. But the thing is that half of it had been burned in the year before because of fire escape from cattle pastures around there. And I said, this doesn't even add up to a hectare. I can't really do an inventory here for you. And one of the workers, local people who were working with her said, and this is why local information is so important, indigenous local information, you cannot really study these landscapes without that. Said, oh, I know where there's a geoglyph that's under forest cover. And he said, what? Well, it's this one down here, 2 kilometers away on the lower left, where the red square is. And he said, but it's not a square, he said, it's a circle. But when the archaeologists with their GPS went into the ditch itself and went around, it turned out that it was in fact a rectangle. And so in there was a large one. I couldn't do a linear forest inventory, so I did a 100 by 100 meter inventory. And then to compare, we went outside of it with the second inventory to see if there was a difference as due to the impact of humans. And it seems to be, there's a whole lot more Phoenicospermum guianensis inside the geoglyph, which is a form of it's in Strelitziaceae. That's in the it's in Gibberellus order. Along with other members of that order include Musaceae, which is the family that bananas are in. And I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. This is taking the place of where trees might otherwise have grown. You also had a huge amount of strangler figs and others. And I think of it as a lianoid forest because of the trees. Many of them were stranglers, or if they weren't, they were trees that had tendrils, and there were a lot of lianas in there. It's a lianoid forest. But I also see it as at a threshold because there was no recent date of occupation. It seems that the lianas are involved in somehow keeping this forest from changing very much over time. And people had not lived here in hundreds of years. So that was sort of the inference that we got from that. And James Andrew Whitaker, who paid that nice tribute to me in what you read, he was one of the authors on the paper we wrote about that. So more recently, I've been working in among non-indigenous people, but they are local people, called in Portuguese, campesinos florestais, which means forest, literally forest peasants. I don't see peasant necessarily as a word of degradation, but some people might see it that way. But they call themselves beiradeiros, which means people of the river edge. I think that's a nice way of putting it. And somebody earlier today said, well, what about governments and conservationism that is actually having people kicked off the landscape? I'm sure I see that person here who had that question. I think it was for Mark, maybe it's for somebody else. But that's a case of it where in the early 2000s, the Brazilian government set up a reserve between the Xingu River and the Iriri River. They call it the Terra do Meio, the land in the middle. And it's about 1 million hectares. It's about the size of Maryland, the size of the state of Maryland. They said, we're not going to allow people to live in this particular area. They could live, however, in certain stretches along the Iriri and the Xingu in what are called extractive reserves, as long as they didn't disturb the environment and they produce things on a sustainable basis, which basically they do. They don't cut the forest down because the most important resources that they use in commerce are Brazil nut. You don't get that if you cut the trees down. There are a lot of Brazil nut trees. Ataleia nuts, and Ataleia is the palm I was mentioning before. It's a pyrophyte. they make a flour from that, which is now sold in schools in the Amazon region. And things like tonka bean, which for centuries have been important in the perfume industry and others. It's in the legume families of tree. There's no point cutting that down because you get it from the seed. So the main resources, the forest peasants or the river edge people don't cut those forests down for that reason. However, as it turns out, we found evidence for the fact that these are actually archaeological sites in here. And because the Brazil nuts are growing on Amazon dark earth, which is a human artifact, there's some thinking that Brazil nut trees are domesticated because they occur in clumps around the Amazon, not all across the Amazon, but they do tend to associate and be coincidental with ancient human occupation. Same with the Atalaya species that were pretty common in that forest, and I mentioned to you before, because of the fact that they survive fire, they could survive swidens. And the Brazil nut trees were laid out in such a way that they were probably around the village site. They're not in close. They're huge trees. If one of those fell, would fall and crash on people's houses. So my colleagues and I, who included archaeologists in this list of authors in a paper we published in Human Ecology, we concluded that the local people, the peasants who are now outside those reserves, and they were told, you have to get out of here, you must leave it, they refused. About 100 of them along a 100-mile stretch of Erie River that's in this area that where no humans are supposed to be living anymore. They're not allowed to be there by the law. But when the Attorney General saw our research for the area, she made a case and got a judgment that they shall be allowed to stay indefinitely because they're not destroying the environment. They're not incompatible with the diversity, the biodiversity as it was. Okay, so it's time for me to stop. I've got maybe 2 minutes. I got 5 minutes for Q&A. All right, let me just run through really quick. This is the Erie River. That's some of the flora. These are some of the people I was talking about. There's tonka bean in the bottom, the local people. There's some evidence of the impact of agriculture. And yeah, so this is my colleague, Vinicius Honorato, the archaeologist. One of the archaeologists I was working with in one of the cubicle excavation pits that they did where they found a lot of artifacts and so on. So what we found is that the local people are actually conserving, which is an ancient heritage of cultural forests and indigenous resource management. And so that's basically brought me to this moment today. And thank you very much. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. Happy to take questions. Comments. Annabelle.
I noticed your use of the word fallow, and I know it to be a term that means an unseeded plowed field, and have sought to find another word because that really isn't a good word for the Swidden system. I wondered if you had given any thought. I actually talked about this also with another colleague, Bill Denevin, who actually just wrote a book with fallow in it. So
I wasn't using the word in this particular context. I'm using the word cultural forest or anthropogenic forest, but that's essentially how I see it.
oh, it was in one of your slides.
Oh, was it? No, it's an
Yeah.
old spot.
Yeah.
Ask me a question.
So the dark soil, is that also similar to the terra preta?
Yes,
Oh,
terra
okay.
preta is a kind of Amazon dark earth. There's another kind called terra mulata. The terra preta has potsherds in it, and it's where people lived and threw their garbage away. You could think of them as middens. But the terra mulata doesn't have the potsherds, but it has the charcoal-enriched soils. It's thought by the early soil scientist from the Netherlands, Wim Somberg, to have been what are garden soils by people practicing intensive agriculture. Before there was swidden agriculture, that's the argument. Denevin agrees with that too, by the way, speaking of Bill Denevin, so.
Bill,
somebody else.
first of all, thank you so much for being such an inspiration to everybody here, and congratulations on this awesome achievement and award.
Thank you.
My question has to do because I did research in Costa Rica for a decade, and I was very concerned with the fact that secondary forests aren't listed as protected areas. So as soon as they're managed, they're basically open now to just anything.
Oh,
And I'm wondering if that's the case, because a lot of the secondary forests in Costa Rica are logged within 20 years. So they lose a lot of that ecological function, even though those forests have a lot of great uses that the primary forests do not have. And you mentioned that the secondary forests here have great diversity, or at least the recovering patches. I'm wondering if there's any similarities to protected area management in the Amazon area.
Well, no, I don't think there is. I mean, I don't think secondary forest per se, and it depends what you mean by that, because that could be a whole range of forests.
Right. So I
But
guess,
it takes time to get to be a mature one, you know,
Yeah.
in the sense of having come back and having these trees, which are long-lived hardwoods like Androanthus species, and Atalaya palms take at
Mhm.
least 20 years to grow up, you know, be fully, you know, mature, and they might last 100 years on the landscape. So I don't mean that happens immediately. It happens with time, but if the early secondary stage of forest is going on and this being, you know, burned up or used in some other way, then that would be, that wouldn't be what I was talking about.
thank you.
Thanks for the question. Nancy.
Hello. I was hoping you could expand a little bit when you talked about that one plot that seemed to have retarded succession back to primary status, and you said it might have something to do with the lianas. And I was
Oh,
wondering
yeah.
if there was any follow-up on that, whether there was any management of lianas that might be connected with that, or if you believe perhaps the lianas come from some other source besides people.
That's a great question. I'm fascinated by this liana stuff. As I was telling Bruce Hoffman earlier today, and he's specializing on that. Now, here's what I think. I think it's possible, and I don't know for sure, but that Phoenicospermum guianensis, which is a succulent, is taking up a lot of the space where otherwise trees could be. Now, why is that? Well, the trees that are there are full of lianas. You know, it's a lianoid forest, and we counted the number of lianas per unit of our inventory, and it was just a very large number. I don't have the number at the top of my head, but it was very much higher than measurements of lianas from other comparable forest inventories elsewhere in the Amazon. So my thinking on it is that logically what's going on, well, and this was what we put in our paper, is that the Phoenicospermum guianensis, which is succulent, does well because lianas can't hang on to it. It doesn't have branches. It doesn't have a hardwood. So that's how that could be there. And the same with the palms. And Francis Putz had talked about this as a liana shedding mechanism many years ago of palms, because they too don't have branches. So that's why palms were very common in that particular, I think, in that particular geoglyph site. But what also I think is there's a huge amount of lianas, and that they're continuingly over time, to the extent that it's not being disturbed anymore since the time of the geoglyph people, that that it's at an ecological threshold. But beyond that, what people may have or may not have used those particular lianas for, I don't know.